Hello everyone, good morning, physical and virtual. Hope you're all relaxed after the yoga session. The topic of the talk today is not so relaxed, but hopefully insightful. The talk today is called Info Pollution, Infobesity, and Attention Monsters. And we have today two wonderful guests, Mario Vasilescu and Jerry Michalski. Mario Vasilescu is co-founder of Readocracy. It's the first information wellness platform, or as he likes to call it, a Fitbit for your information diet. And Jerry is the founder of the Open Global Mind. It's a project that is designed to help humans take better decisions together. I myself, my name is ISABELA CONSTANTIN. I'm by training a machine learning engineer and also a former co-host of last year's News Rehab. If you haven't watched it, I highly recommend you do, because the conversations that we had there will intersect and complement the talk today. If you, as a brief or as a reminder, we basically called in people from different walks of life, researchers, entrepreneurs, artists, to come and share with us their daily reading habits to hopefully inspire us to get better ourselves at reading news. And so we went into the really nitty-gritty details and asked our guests to share their screens and do basically a walkthrough of a typical routine of them consuming news on a daily basis. Some interesting patterns emerged. Some guests were guided by their curiosity and followed topics of interest, while others were very diligent in reading the news and making sure they get a uniform coverage of political biases on a country geographical dimension, and so on, in order to get an accurate picture of the world. Today, we will continue our endeavor of cultivating tools for better thinking with this talk, in which we will talk about the information crisis, and we will unpack it and propose to solve it with concrete tools, both at individual level and at the collective level. The talk, like everything here at Unfinished, is an experiment and a bit of a hybrid. It will be divided into two parts, in which Mario will share his insights and his research, and in between we will have time for discussion, questions, and brain food, as we said just before. So without further ado, Mario, I pass it to you.
Thank you very much, Isabella. I'm super excited to be here. I think who we have on the stage here makes for a perfect combination for this conversation. So, yeah, without further ado, I guess I'll dive in. And like Isabella said, there's going to be two parts here, and I'm actually going to stand, so I'm not sitting for 10 to 15 minutes while I chat here before the discussion. Then I'll rest my legs when we get there. So part one is going to be about info pollution, infobesity, and then we'll take a break, talk, and then part two will be about attention monsters. So why talk about these things? The point of this presentation, and hopefully the discussion, will be to change how we see and think about solving the information crisis, the information epidemic, the age of information disorder, however you want to talk about it. And before I dive in, I just want to reiterate, the information crisis is now mainstream. Whatever you want to call it, it is mainstream. I don't think any of us in this room can go a week without seeing a headline about the impact of fake news, about having an argument in their family about something that seems questionable or strange, or simply having a conversation with friends about how, oh, I just lost 3 hours on TikTok, I don't know how this thing works so effectively on me, etc. So there's clearly a problem that touches so many areas. And that's kind of the problem. It's so nebulous that we don't really know how to talk about it or where to start. But just to drive home the point of how mainstream it is and how we're not alone and everybody's thinking about this, I thought it was so interesting when The Social Dilemma came out. If you haven't seen it yet on Netflix, I highly recommend seeing it. It was the first time, this documentary, which if you don't know is about surveillance capitalism and obviously the issues of the big tech and social media platforms on us, This was the first time that a documentary was the most popular movie in a month on Netflix, regardless of whether it was documentary or not. Extremely popular. So again, mainstream. So if it is so nebulous, how do we think and talk about it more effectively? And I think one of the underrated ways, which we don't look at enough, is to realize that there are other huge challenges that humanity has faced, which in hindsight now seem well mapped and we have a clear sense of what to do about them, but were equally nebulous and troubling at the beginning. And so let's use those as templates for us to have more clarity of how we can think about and do something about the information crisis. So the first one we can use is the environmental crisis. The environmental crisis, again, extremely nebulous problem. It covered the whole world, right? It does cover the whole world. So we have Earth, this miracle environment we all live on, this spaceship Earth that gives us everything we need, replenishing. We don't have to do anything. It just takes care of us if we take care of it. And what have we done to it to take care of it? We all know now that we haven't been the best custodians. And now it is, of course, ingrained in our thought, worrying about littering, all these things. It's in our consciousness of how to think about the problem. But we have to remember that we have another precious environment that we share together now. We have the information environment, which spans the globe. And just like the physical Earth gives us what we need to eat and breathe and be physically healthy, the information environment gives us what we need to think together and think clearly and hopefully be healthy. Whether you love him or hate him, Elon Musk has had a couple of great quotes about this. He said, "If you go back a few hundred years, what we take for granted today would seem like magic. Being able to talk to people over long distances, to transmit images, accessing vast amounts of data like an oracle. It is like a miracle. It is comparable to this physical miracle we have. We now have an informational hive mind together. It's like humanity acquiring a collective nervous system, whereas previously we were more like a collection of cells. So we are thinking together. The problem is, of course, we said, well, how will we make money with this thing? And the answer was attention. And so with attention, more eyeballs equals more money. And that's how this precious space we used to think together started feeling and looking a lot like this. And so the same way we think about what we've done to our physical environment, we should be thinking about what we're doing to our informational environment and how the way it affects the physical environment affects our physical selves, this informational environment affects our information cells. We can see that parallel. Again, it's like humanity acquiring a collective nervous system. So what happens to how we think and how we think together when this is what it becomes, and information pollution becomes mainstream, and how we take care of it? So if we look back to what we did and what we are doing about the environmental crisis, well, education. We taught people about the importance of the environment. It is now in most education systems to educate children about this, have units about it, make them understand. We denormalized waste and littering. There's now a stigma attached to it. If somebody just throws stuff on the street, people are going to judge them. That's through education. Mandatory context. There are now labels on everything, and you're seeing them more and more. If you try to buy a dishwasher, a fridge, right, there's labels telling you about the impact. Making it count. We now measure our pollution. We see news headlines talking about our collective emissions. What are we doing about it? You start quantifying it. What is our collective impact? And laws on unhealthy impact. So there are laws, of course, now after the Industrial Revolution. You could do whatever you wanted. You could throw whatever you wanted out there, pollute the rivers. We wisened up to that, and now there are very strict rules on this. So, if we have that for Earth, what do we have for our information environment that spans the Earth? We can use the same patterns. The importance of the impact on our information environment. You could just as well have units in school that help people understand this collective mind we have together and the importance of being a good custodian. Denormalizing careless volume. Is it normal that the internet today makes it okay that you can post 50 or 100 times in a day, or post 50 things just because it'll help you get more followers? What happens when everything becomes noise and there is no signal? Mandatory context. So again, the same way we have labels on products we buy, can we have labels in our information commons, on websites, on content, that again are transparent and data-driven, just like the ones on our products? Making it count. Can we measure this collective noise that we're putting out? We already know the data that apparently human data and knowledge is doubling every 12 hours as of a few years ago. How much of that is actually quality, or is it just people trying to game the algorithms, knowing that if they post 6 times a day on TikTok, that's how they're going to get their followers? And laws on unhealthy impact. Toxic content laws. Laws perhaps on if you have over 50,000 followers, if you have over 100,000 followers, should you have some standards and expectations and laws attached to that? Or is it a free-for-all, just like it was after industrialization with the polluters? So what you'll notice here is there is a shift from the individual, the consumer, to the producers. Until now, and in these systems, we shifted the consequences from the end user back onto the producers who are at the root cause causing the problem. And the awareness, in the case of factories polluting, they had all the data. They knew their volume. They knew what they were doing. But the awareness was given back to the consumers. Same thing we can do with our digital environment. Advertisers have tons of analytics. Publishers have tons of analytics. What do you have? What do you know about yourself? That data is all hoarded. So what can we change about that? Again, the shift, consequences and awareness. So, big challenge number 2 that we can look through, and that is the obesity epidemic. It is not so long ago when these were normal advertisements that didn't seem funny and bizarre. It is not so long ago when our parents and grandparents were basically feeding us sludge from the grocery store shelves without realizing or having any ill intention. They just didn't know and they weren't equipped to know. It was fine. I mean, it's almost like parody, but it's real. Like a child with a burger, a meal in itself, youngest customers in the business. We give kids all the energy they need through candy, et cetera, et cetera. This was normal. So what did we do about it? Education. Again, most curriculum now have units on nutrition and physical health and how you feed yourself and the importance of that. Mandatory context, right? Not just nutrition labels, but ingredient labels. Ingredient labels weren't always mandatory. They didn't always have to be transparent or rational. And then on top of that, of course, now we have nutrition labels. There are so many standards we've attached to it, which are in the public consciousness now. Making it count, of course, again, quantified through those labels, understanding what we're doing in terms of our daily habits, our weekly habits, our monthly habits, having lots of research on the impact of that. And laws on unhealthy influence. Those advertisements, most of them are illegal now. You know, before you could go out and say, I'm going to do a campaign telling people that they should feed their children a 3-kilogram burger every day. And that was fine. You can't do that anymore. So, as a result of all these changes, when you look at this picture, all of you, I guarantee, have at least one concept from the ones I just mentioned immediately in your mind. Look left versus right, immediately. Thinking about healthy diet, nutrition labels, how's that going to make me feel? How many calories does it count? What are the ingredients in here? Are there any government efforts? Oh, I heard an ad about how salt intake, this and that. There's so much that immediately comes to mind. We are conditioned by education and the laws around us. So we can compare that and say there's an infobesity epidemic now. What happens when I overlay these images of these articles? If I give you an hour to spend on really exciting clickbait content, celebrities, whatever it may be on the left, and on the right, I give you some timeless content from incredible authors, how will you spend that hour? For most people, no clear ideas that are even comparable to the ones about food come to our minds. We have to rely on our own vague sense of guilt and motivation and responsibility and being a good civic citizen, which in the moment, acting on your impulse are pretty weak filters. And we have to hope you even have those, which a lot of people just aren't conditioned to think about it. It's consequence-free. It's irrelevant. You just do what you feel like and nobody will ever know. And you won't even know how to think about it yourself. But the problem is that because of the way, when we talked about information pollution, how we monetize through attention, this stuff is lost in a sea of this stuff. And so there is so much noise with so little signal and such high volume we're dealing with, right? The fire hose, the overload. How do you deal with that if you're not equipped to have any education or context or anything around it? And so this is how we end up in a situation where we have a system that is designed to make you gorge yourself every day. We spend 7 hours every day on our devices, at least in most places around the world, designed to make you gorge yourself without ever thinking about it. It's like a replenishing buffet designed for you each time. But the thing is, as we know, you are what you eat. And we can see the impacts of this all around us when we say it's an infobesity epidemic. When you talk about addiction, you talk about depression, you talk about violence, dissolving democracy, or a fundamental pollution of truth. You can look at this as an infobesity epidemic. And one last point I'll add on this, that you can extend the metaphor, the analogy even further. Just like with obesity, this is also a matter of access and affordability. A lot of people are unhealthy because they can't afford to be healthier. They can't afford better food and ingredients. And right now, more and more, the internet looks like that. You've reached your limit on the good stuff. I hope you have money to afford it. Otherwise, have fun eating all of that. And there's a lot of that. So, again, when we compare these, the obesity epidemic, the infobesity epidemic, and we map them, we can look at education that we can teach people about these concepts, because there's such tight parallels. This can really help people visualize and understand how to think about it. Availability. Again, people are so quick to dismiss the value of public journalism and publicly funded journalism in a lot of countries. And even where they do have great public journalism, publicly funded journalism, they say, let's shut it down. I don't want my taxpayers' dollars going to that. Well, guess what? You're going to have a lot of infobese people. Mandatory context. There's no reason with the data and tools we have now, you cannot have better labels on everything we're looking at. And it does not have to be something that deals with somebody deciding on opinion. There's so many AI models now that can simply look for rage bait indicators, clickbait indicators, hyperbole. Making it count, making it quantified so you can even measure for yourself how you're spending your time. Did you spend the whole week on negative content? Do you even know? How much of it was political? Which way was it leaning in terms of political bias? Are you getting everything from media that is owned by one source? What is the bias culturally? Gender? Do you have any idea about these things that are shaping your mind? And laws and unhealthy influence, of course. Again, advertising regulation, algorithmic regulation. If we can regulate what people can advertise to us in terms of how we feed our bodies, why is it okay for them to try to game our minds to get us just as unhealthy there? So again, shifting the consequences and the awareness in the opposite direction from the producers and the consumers. So we can equip ourselves, and then the consequences are on them. This is the shift we need to have. And so lastly, before we get to the discussion here, an essential consideration that I'm sure some of you are thinking about when we talk about these things, if you're adding labels, if you're limiting people, if you're fining people who have over a certain number of followers, okay, what about censorship? Which is a very valid question. And there's two things that I think are really important to understand about this when you talk about censorship. First of all, there is a huge difference between freedom of speech and freedom of reach. Just because you can say something, there is not an obligation that everybody else should have to listen to you. And a lot of times when people conflate these things, this is what they're actually doing. They're saying, I don't want to give other people context. How dare you put any limitations on any of this? I should have maximum free reign. No consequences, no context. Let me do my thing. This is why when you talk about these issues online, usually the loudest people who get the angriest are the trolls. And again, the idea, it's not about stopping anybody from saying anything or closing anything down. It is simply context. So there's a big difference between us having this overload without any context and just equipping people with context. Some people will say, oh, it's censorship is a limitation of my freedom. You shouldn't be telling me what's good, what's bad. Freedom is actually being equipped to think for yourself. Otherwise, you're like in one of those like funhouse mirror rooms without even realizing it. And this is the difference between equipped and not. And so finally, also, there's a big difference between individual responsibility and industrial responsibility. Just like somebody who litters on the ground doesn't deal with the same fines as an industrial polluter who has ruined a whole river or a whole town's groundwater or the soil. When we talk about these things, people are so quick to say, oh my God, everybody's going to get these fines, this and that. If we just dealt with like the really big producers, that would already be enough, and everybody else can just mind their own business. But we don't even do that. And there is a big difference. So, that was part one. Let's discuss. I'll sit down now.
Do you want to take us in?
Yeah, so thank you so much, Mario. So many metaphors came to mind when it comes to the parallel with pollution and obesity. So thank you for feeding us all these thoughts. Yeah, I would like to maybe start the discussion, and then everybody can chime in and contribute with a question about your own diet, just to continue the threading from last year. If you have some principles, so I was thinking of snacking, intermittent fasting, all these things have an equivalent in the information diet. Maybe you can share us a bit about your own diet.
Yeah, totally.
And if you allow yourself some guilty pleasures, that's also,
of course,
curious.
Totally. And I think in this conversation, that like good prompt, I think it's so important to understand that there's nothing wrong with junk food. I love McDonald's, but I shouldn't be eating it every day. And at least I should know when I do. And I should be able to clearly differentiate. So yes, of course, guilty pleasures. For me, it's sports. So I would say, unproductive and guilty pleasure. I'm from Toronto in Canada, and I compulsively check on every single sports team every day from the city, especially the Raptors. And so that's, I would not consider that productive, but I do that every day. Outside of that, I do try to, and again, it's hard to talk about these things without talking about Readocracy, but I think it's, I try to weave in curiosity every day. I try to make a good portion of what I consume things that kind of tickle my brain, and they make me go, like, okay, that's kind of quirky or amusing, or that changed my perspective. So that's, I think, like the bedrock for me.
And do you also have enforcement in your diet? So, because I like this idea with pursuing things that tickle your curiosity, but there's a big difference between pursuing these things at the beginning of the day, or maybe when you're energized, and at the end of the day when your willpower is much lower and maybe you have much more likelihood to get into other things. Do you have some limits?
Yes and no. So yes, in the sense that I try to apportion my time through Readocracy in some ways, which I'll explain later, but in terms of like what's long form versus things that are just like tidbits on Instagram. So I try to limit my social media use where it's just like these little snacks. I try to limit that to a certain time of the day. And in general, I try to not have my phone in the room wherever possible, to not even tempt me. Yeah.
That's a good one.
Yeah, actually on that note, it's made a big difference not keeping my phone in my room when I go to sleep, so that before bed and when I wake up in the morning, there's no chance of me touching my phone. I actually use an old BlackBerry just as an alarm. It's not connected to the internet, can't do anything with it. I think it looks nice as the passport. Shout out BlackBerry, good Canadian company. And yeah, it's just an alarm.
Thanks for sharing.
There's a whole topic called digital literacy, which has many different kind of definitions. But one of the principal definitions isn't about how do you use email, which is a sort of a form of computer literacy, but rather when do you put down the device, and how do you manage to stay away from all these sorts of things. You provoked 100 different thoughts for me, and I've been sort of taking notes here. My apologies for having a laptop open, but it helps me sort of remember what to say. But does anybody remember the world before smartphones? A couple people. Before the internet, before you could just look anything up. Like, isn't that crazy? We just fallen through this little rabbit hole, and the problem is that the major business model for the rabbit hole is advertising, and the major goal of advertising is to addict us. And they're very, very, very good at that, right? And so my last 30 years have been informed by one little light bulb that went off in my head back when, in the 90s, mid-90s, when I realized I didn't like the word consumer. And so what you're describing is the consumerization of our infosphere, of the information medium, and the business models that propel us into doing stupid things. And I love your slide about, hey, the good stuff is behind a paywall because they have to make a living somehow. And access to the world's billions of humans is free and unfettered, and oops. And there's a funny little backstory in that Elon Musk is trying and failing and trying to buy Twitter.
Oh my God, yeah.
And if he manages to own Twitter, he might reinstate Donald Trump, and there's an info-apocalypse going to happen then. Right? Because and there's a whistleblower who's talking about why Trump wasn't deplatformed earlier. This is actually socially, politically, critically important policy.
Yeah. And on that subject, I think the debate around Twitter, I think is so important, because one thing that Elon Musk said, which I think is just wrong, is that Twitter is so important and we have to preserve it because that will be the information commons. That will preserve democracy. That will be the future of our thinking together. And I understand some way of seeing that. Like, yes, people being able to tweet from war zones and, revolutions and whatnot. But how can you possibly believe that a system that is designed to make us put out like fortune cookie wisdom and things in little snippets and like threads and whatnot, like distill everything down to these little snippets, how is that going to be where we have meaningful conversation, understand each other, and think clearly? It seems like, if anything, if that became the thing, that'd be very concerning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, the good stuff is still out there. Like, everybody says the internet is dead. Well, not everybody. Many people are trying to say the web is dead, the internet is dead, we're in trouble. I'm having fantastic interactions online, finding incredible materials, curating them myself sort of into an ongoing memory. And the problem is you need to understand how to tune your tools and how to change your process. And that takes some kind of learning, which is not that easily available. And so I'm happy for startups like yours, which are trying to help people figure all that stuff out. But the good stuff is still out there, and it's out there. This digital commons, you had the one image of the digital earth after the earth. That's called the new commons. The old commons are things like forests and clean air and clean water and mineral rights and all that kind of stuff. The new commons are these limitless digital spaces that are uncontrolled. One person I'm going to point to tomorrow when I do my talk at 3:00 is Eleanor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics despite not being an economist, for governance models of the commons. Real commons. She's aware of digital commons, but her work was on lobster fisheries in Maine, sort of thing. And governing commons takes the kinds of rules you were describing. So it's really important that we start to figure that out as a society, because we're all busy like wasting a third of our day doom scrolling. And if we don't get out of the doom loop, we're going to lose our civilization. These are important. This isn't just about getting informationally fat. This is about whether we preserve society as we wish to have it.
Yeah. And also how we spend our time. I mean, what could we accomplish if this wasn't eating so much time? I think I gave a presentation a few years ago, and at the time when I looked at Facebook's disclosures, every month on Facebook ate something like 1.1 million months of human attention. It was like, what could you do with that? What could we do with that? I mean, you look at Gangnam Style back in the day, had like, I don't know, 1 billion views. It's like, it's good stuff, but at the same time, you add all these things up, and a system that tries to get you to spend all your time with it. What could we do with that as a society?
Let me add a little wrinkle to that. We're busy. We're in the info torrent. Everything is a flood past us. And there's this systems thinking idea of stocks versus flows. A river is a flow of water. A lake is a stock of water. We're drowning in the flows of information, and we have very few tools to create stocks of information. So anybody ever use Wikipedia? Raise your hand if you use Wikipedia. Kind of everybody. Wikipedia is a stock of information that keeps getting better. You don't look at Wikipedia for fresh posts every day, right? Not what you do. You look at Wikipedia for not definitive, but pretty good information about just about everything that matters in the world, including there's pages in there for every episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. It's like, that was never going to make Britannica, right? Britannica was never going to have a page. There's a page for Buffy studies, which is an academic discipline now. So the problem is we don't have places to curate what we know. So the collective intelligence you sort of hinted at here, right this minute, remember in biology class, you saw little pictures of a twitching neuron on a plate where you give it a little electric stimulus and it goes like this and the little frog's leg kind of twitches? That's our current state. We are nowhere near collective intelligence, except every now and then on a mass scale, some phenomenon emerges that seems like collective intelligence, which is very cool. But in an organized sense of sharing what we know and why we believe it, and then comparing and contrasting it in some efficient way, we're not doing that at all. And that's partly my goal in life, is to figure out how to stand that up. So I love this conversation.
Yeah, no, and those are all such good points, especially the stocks and flows. It's so important when you have a system that is only obsessed with the flows. What does it do for you to even be able to dive into the stocks when you're just like always swept over? And, you know, when you were saying that, Wikipedia is good because there isn't like, oh, here's what's new. It's because you can grow, you can add depth. You just don't add depth to the rest. And without depth.
And also we drown in the flood. We sort of drown and you feel disoriented. And when you feel disoriented, you're sort of unmoored and you're willing to grab any belief system that comes by, right? And then things that heat you up, get you interested, will addict you and get you connected to a belief system that a year before you would never have contemplated joining.
The currents.
Yeah, exactly. And this just spirals downward. And there's a bunch of people out there in the world who understand sociology, psychology, anthropology, and a bunch of other disciplines a little bit too well, and have figured out how to use this against us. Yep. And we're trying to make our way through in this like hard moment. And you should probably do the second part of...
I know we're going to have a lot to talk about with that one. Did you have any like last points with news rehab or anything, like how it connects to that? Or
I'm very excited about the parallel with the tools. So also super excited about Readocracy. But yeah, let's switch to part 2.
Okay, cool. This is where it's going to get spicy. All right, so part 2, attention monsters. So again, we kind of put it through this lens of how do we think and talk about these issues more effectively, right? The information crisis, it's so nebulous. How do we talk? So we already gave you some lenses that hopefully clarify, give you some very clear parallels. The other way we can do it is by getting better at calling out the people and the system and being able to identify it more clearly. So this is the third lens, attention monsters. We tend to focus too exclusively on the platforms and not enough on the people who are actually doing the damage and using the platforms. When you look at all the regulation that's talked about, it's almost always at the platform level. And in some ways, I can understand the platforms throwing up their hands and be like, okay, but like, what about the people? Of course, the platforms are responsible, but also so are these attention monsters. And we don't talk about it enough. When I was mentioning information pollution, why does somebody with 50,000, 100,000, 1 million followers have total, free reign, despite publishers of the same size who are not exploiting the same tactics, having their own rules attached to them in other formats? So, some very important news a few months ago, which is ongoing. The Alex Jones trial. I'm sure we're going to have good conversation around this. In case you don't know, and you're saying, who is Alex Jones? Alex Jones is this gentleman behind Infowars, and he is one of, if not the, godfather of modern fake news. And what I mean by modern fake news is somebody who rose to fame and did incredibly well in this new environment where things could go viral on Facebook, posts could go crazy on social media, podcasts could go have many places of easy distribution. So why was he on trial? And this is a segue to kind of get to attention monsters. Why was he on trial? In the United States, there was a mass shooting at a school. There's been many, of course, but Sandy Hook specifically. And he was making lots of fake news stories, angrily, determinedly, trying to convince people with his huge audience that those children and the parents and everybody involved was actually an actor. And there was a whole government plot and secret powers. And the result of that was that these parents who had their children murdered had to deal with tons of people threatening them and wanting to kill them and destroying the memory of their children, undermining it, while also threatening them and ruining their lives and their well-being and their mental safety. This is what he was profiting off of. And this is just one of the many crazy stories he's put out for his own benefit. That's why he's on trial and finally getting some comeuppance for it. But this barely ever happens. There's almost never consequences. This is an outlier. And it's probably only because he's so big. And it took a while. And it's still ongoing. So he's an attention monster. He's, an example of an attention monster. And I don't use the word monster in the term like a fun, cute way. When we describe somebody as a monster, when you're like calm or angry and you're saying somebody's a monster, that's a heavy word, right? We associate it with war crimes and this sort of stuff. And I think it is a valid word to use that we should normalize to understand the weight of what we are dealing with here. So let's give it a definition. Obviously, unfinished, so we're working on this if you want to help me refine it. But an attention monster is somebody who deliberately spreads lies or deliberately incites anger, destroying lives, communities, entire countries. You look at populism all around the world, primarily for their own personal profit. And this is a really important distinction because you could be an activist who is fighting for something noble and getting people riled up because you need to. Those people are not doing it for profit. You can pretty clearly see when they're just doing it in the moment for something that's come up, their life story. It's also pretty clear when people are doing it for profit. And you need to understand, and the reason this trial was so important was because it uncovered some numbers. We don't usually have numbers on these things. We need to make it mainstream that people understand how profitable, how outrageously profitable it is to be an attention monster. So if you don't know, the numbers that were revealed during the trial, on his best days, Alex Jones and his little team were making $800,000 a day. And he amassed a fortune of around $230 million, it's estimated, from spreading these deliberate lies which are ruining people's lives. And he is just one. And the question is, when you see these numbers, most people's reactions are like, wow, why isn't everybody doing this? Oh, I'm going to start doing this. I got to make some money. The thing is, people already are. This is why it's like this. And we often don't understand or we can't clearly point to it. This is how it gets so polluted when it is so insanely lucrative. You'll have a lot of people who see this fake news, see these things, and they'll say, why would they lie to me? What's in it for them? Why are you telling me it's fake? This is legit. There is so much money to be had. And the product of attention monsters, this is the product of attention monsters as much as it is the platform. So of course the platforms facilitate, they make it possible, they make it easy for these attention monsters, but ultimately it is the attention monsters which are using the platforms. Again, primarily for their own personal profit. And the thing is that you will notice with virtually every one of these posts is you can almost always find the grift or the scam if you bother to spend a minute looking for it. But people don't. Coronavirus. Fears that 5G Wi-Fi networks could be acting as an accelerator for the pandemic. One of the biggest 5G conspiracy theorists in the UK, who was even involved in some of the official right-wing government party speeches, would have their videos and their posts and drumming up all this anxiety. And on their personal website, if you had bothered to look, they were selling, along with their various conspiracy friends, USB sticks that would protect you from the 5G waves. They were selling them for $350. Do you know how much a cheap USB stick costs?
Pennies.
Yes. Full profit. Becoming millionaires. You will always find the grift. In Canada, it's now in the news now if you've seen it. It's ridiculous. A woman who says through QAnon, super popular, a huge reason why there's so much division in the United States and now in other countries. This QAnon-affiliated woman, which says that actually secretly she's the Queen of Canada, and she's been approved by the FBI or something. And she has 70,000 members in her Telegram group. Oh, guess what? She's raised more than $100,000 so that she can tour Canada in an RV. That's funny. You will always, always find the grift in some form or fashion if you bother to look. And so these attention monsters are everywhere behind almost every major device of outrage. Why are they so effective? First of all, human nature mixed with the design of social media. So I'm definitely not giving the platforms a free pass. And the lack of consequences. So let's dig into that very quickly. Human nature. If you don't know what Cunningham's law is an internet law that says the best way to get a right answer on the internet is not to ask the question, it's to post the wrong answer. Because everybody will pile on wanting to correct you. So human nature, we're easily inflamed, especially in social environments. We're easily provoked, goaded. So you already have that. But then you have the design of social media, which because they rely on this attention, as many eyeballs as possible, maximum attention, it is frictionless. We're used to it because we grew up with it and we think it's normal. It's not really normal that when you open any of these apps, there's a thing at the top saying, what's happening to you right now? Post right now. Don't think about it. Just put something out there. We're conditioned to react and post as quickly as possible, high volume, without putting a thought into it. God forbid, because that would be bad for the business. They're designed deliberately to be totally frictionless. There are several studies that show that false news spreads faster than the truth online and on the platforms. This is proven. There's that old saying that while a lie makes its way around the world, the truth is still putting on its shoes. Or tying its shoes, something to that effect. We've basically systematized that and said like, oh, it's not just like this thing that's human nature. We're going to put a platform behind it and make it really, really easy and make sure it works. Secondly, lack of consequences. A useful analogy around consequences. The illicit drug trade. Highly addictive, deadly substances. Fentanyl, let's say. Killing a lot of people. When we look at who gets punished for these illicit drugs, is it the factories or the underground production lines that are the only ones who get in trouble? No, it's almost always when we see headlines, it's the dealers, the middlemen who profited off the system. Why is this not the case in this environment, in this situation? We're used to the paradigm one way, but we don't map it here. What can we do to shift the balance? Again, what can we do to shift this balance so that the awareness doesn't go from the people who know really well how to game the system, the attention monsters who profit from it? How do we shift this so we have the awareness and the consequences go to them? So first of all, design of social media. Requiring context on social media. What would happen if you had one, freebie post where you say whatever you want, and everything else for the rest of the day, you have to attach like a full paragraph of why you're posting this thing. Or you have to attach a link that justifies the thing you're about to post. What would happen then? What would happen if, when you were looking through a feed, you had tons of context that was making you kind of stop? You see something inflammatory, instead of be like, oh my God, I'm angry, and they could do the thing, the Cunningham's Law thing. What would happen if there was a label saying 95% of this person's posts are super inflammatory? Would you give it the same immediate reaction? But again, we don't have that now. We don't have context. We don't have friction. Add consequences. It is super profitable to be Alex Jones or anybody like him, and the millions that do it. right? Like the Macedonian teenagers who undermined elections in America. And when you speak to them in interviews, they're like, oh, you must hate America. It's like, I don't really care. I don't know what's going on there, but like I made a ton of money. It should be really expensive, not profitable, to be an attention monster. We have it backwards. So, what can you do? Learn to spot it and call it out. How to spot an attention monster. First of all, I would highly recommend, this was a quote you might already know, a journalist friend told me that has always stuck with me. Always ask, who is profiting from my anger? Whenever you start feeling angry and you see something online, stop. Who is profiting from my anger? So, let's make it systematic. I think these are kind of 3 principles we can use. This kind of process. How does a post make you feel? Angry and judgmental, or calm and thoughtful? You only have so long to live. How are you going to spend your time? And do you appreciate others hijacking your attention and making you feel this way? So this is an important question to ask. 2 parts to this one. Does their other content rely more on making people feel or think? Because again, if you're relying only on making people feel without thinking, you are manipulating. You need to ask that question. Do they use obvious agitation tactics and rarely use rational, calm, richly sourced arguments? Is it like judgmental? Is it us versus them? Is it look at how stupid or ridiculous this person is? Or like snide, backhanded comments? Or is it like, oh, you know, I was looking into this. This is interesting. And posting like a reputable source. These are like fairly rational filters. We just don't use them. Finally, how do they make their money? This is so important, the profit. Is there an opportunity to make advertising dollars? If you're on YouTube and you're getting lots of traffic, you are making advertising money. Products, again, $350 USB sticks. Alex Jones is known for having all the snake oil type of merchandise he makes his money through. Every type of scam you could think of from a product he has in his store. And sponsors, if you have 1 million, 2 million followers on Twitter, you should really be asking what their affiliations are. You'll often find them. Some of the most inflammatory people, for example, in US politics right now on Twitter, there you can find contracts between them and different parties, them and different networks. This is not always the case, but you should ask and dig, because in most cases you will find something. So, last thing, so we have 10 minutes to talk about this wonderful subject. Very quickly, and I'll have office hours later. What do? We try with Readocracy to tackle some of these problems with solutions through these frameworks. So, Infobesity. What can we do to equip you with awareness and mindfulness? What would happen if you had like a Fitbit for your mind, where every week or every month you understood your mood, the bias, the influences, had like a map of your brain and all the entities and subjects, tendencies, who owns the media you consume? What would happen if you just had that? What we know from the students and people who have used it, you just need to see your own chart once. You don't even need to keep using it. Just knowing that this exists will make you think twice. Because there's a mirror of you somewhere that you're going to have to look at and see yourself, that you're becoming. What about motivating you? There's no consequence now. If you spend all your time looking at really good content, nobody's going to give you a pat on the back or a reward or something. Who cares? Right? So what if you had an intellectual portfolio which turned all the amazing content you consume into something that was quantified, data-driven, and actually came with LinkedIn upgrades, Twitter upgrades, newsletter upgrades, resume upgrades, presentation upgrades? What would that do when you know how you're spending your time? Would you spend the time just like, Or would you then think about maybe, this could be going into something that might help my career, might help me look better in Discord, or whatever it may be. Control and awareness. Right now, when I talked about algorithmic regulation, my bet is that we had the first wave, GDPR, CCPA, all these regulations around privacy. I'm pretty confident the next wave is going to be algorithmic regulation. It's going to make just as big of a splash. And so it's really important to have control. What would happen if instead of just going to YouTube, going to Twitter, and just having it come to you, or having 30 newsletters and just hoping as you scour through them you find the right thing? We talked about this, right? Like gardening and control and building something. What would happen if you could build your perfect information routine and have total transparency in the algorithm to say like, this is something I compulsively spend time on. I don't want to see it more than 3 times in a week. This is the stuff I'm trying to go deep on. Give me some good stuff on this at least 5 times in a week. I'm compulsively looking at negative, anxious stuff. I don't want more than 50% negative news, and I don't want more than 50% politics. And within this, burst your filter bubble. Mix in things that are the opposite of what you consume. And info pollution, awareness, and incentives. Right now, journalism is dying everywhere because it's a nice to have. It doesn't actually have any value because we just measure it for advertising. People spend over $1 trillion every year on their degrees, their certificates, memberships, how they show the world that they're informed and trustworthy. What would happen if great content could turn into a certificate or a degree or a credential that maps onto LinkedIn or your resume? Would you change how you think about spending your time with quality content? Would it become something that's other than a nice to have? And on Attention Monsters context, this is Twitter today. The person with the most likes is at the top. What would happen if Twitter had a little color code on the side where you had green, you had yellow at the bottom, and even though this person had fewer likes, it tells you they're well-informed and helpful. And when you hover on that, it shows you all their sources of information, all the notes they've taken. You don't have to trust on a third party to tell you they're trustworthy. You just see it. You just hover. What would happen then on Twitter, on Discord? So that's what we do. I have office hours later if you want to learn more about it, ask questions. For now, we have 8 to 10 minutes. I would love to
10
talk
minutes
about all
plus
this.
lunch, so hey.
Yeah, you got brain food here, so yeah.
Thank you so much, Mario. I am definitely so excited about Readocracy and also so fired up about this topic. But before getting ourselves caught, I was wondering if there are any questions online or in the audience that maybe we can take. Otherwise,
okay. So I was just wondering what's your take on the cancel culture, like talking about the monsters. How do you feel about cancel culture? Because I feel like cancel culture is kind of a violent reaction of the society once it had too much of these monsters. This is how I think about it. But
I'll take that. So when I do this, it means I agree with what's being said. When I do this, it means I disagree. When I do this, I'm like, meh. So, and I welcome you to use these hand signs at any time at all. It's non-interruptive way of saying what you think. So I'm not, jumping in and barging in.
You have a really good example of like a general in the Navy.
Yeah. So I gave a speech in San Antonio, Texas, which is sort of a military town, in front of 50 officers in uniform, in a facility where all my gear had to be in the trunk outside in the parking lot. And I had a colonel who was basically doing jazz hands and laughing. And I'm like, this works for everybody. We're good. So I think that's a really nice framing of what you're saying, because cancel culture in some sense is an overreaction, and it's causing the far right to go crazy and go, we don't want cancel culture. But cancel culture is an attempt to stop the people who are screaming, eating our brains, and basically taking over the narratives. So there's a very dysfunctional dynamic happening in the marketplace. It's not even a marketplace in some sense, but out in the arena, let's call it. But I really like how you framed that. I totally agree.
Yeah, and I think what happens is I've been working on a post for a while. I guess I've become obsessed with analogies, but I also think the idea of the attention economy being a virus that is like eating our society, eating our brains is like a good one. And I think it kind of co-opts everything. Like anything that is good and noble initially will just get eaten by it. And so I think there's very legitimate areas where we stand up to power, where people who have never been accountable to certain things, like that makes sense. But I think what happens then is people can profit off of it. There's a reason, and I think it's so irresponsible, that the media, the mainstream media, has gone overboard. So again, these things need airtime. But when you try to find something divisive and latch it on to a movement because it's popular and you only get attention, that is irresponsible. And there's a lot of people who profit off of this. And that's, I think, why we have an overreaction, because it's been co-opted and it's just so in our face, just like everything else.
If you do have a question, catch her eye so that you can get the microphone.
Or do this.
Or you can, jingle your hands.
Yeah. So we have many formats for consumption. And do you think we're going to go back to reading more, or how do you see? What is your take on being audio, video, or text, on how we consume content?
I'm happy to jump into. So there's a small movement of people who think that text writing was a temporary hack and that we're going to go into some post-literate society. And my answer to that is, show me anywhere, the non-textual system that communicates as well as text does, right? And I haven't seen it. I haven't seen a system of icons or gestures or even movies which, tug at your emotions. I haven't seen anything that manages what text does. Not that text replaces all the other things. Pardon? How about podcasts? So audio is really interesting because everybody says we don't read long form stuff anymore. And yet people are listening to 2-hour podcasts like that. Maybe, and their commutes went away with pandemic mostly. So it's not that, right? But they're willing to have patience. Audio has this very interesting feature. I used to love the telephone. We don't make many phone calls anymore, but I used to love the telephone because I can whisper on the phone and be closer to you in sort of that circle of intimacy that we guard. I can be closer to you than I can get standing next to you. It's really interesting. So audio contains so much emotional valence, right? And now we're moving into metaverses with 3D avatars. And ironically, the fix for having to wear a mask in the metaverse is we scan your face, then we lip sync what you're saying back onto your avatar in this 3D. It's horrible. It's just horrible where they think we're heading with everybody wearing masks and trying to simulate this thing, right? So I think audio is good. And I think these media all kind of complement each other. And so far, they're still very separate. I love when somebody has used chapters on YouTube and I can go see where I can scroll through and see what sections are in there. I would love it even more if the video were linked out to a bunch of other things actively so that I could then follow what they're quoting, right? And a few people use info cards or other things well, but it's very clumsy. So it feels to me like the media right now, in the early days of movies, we put a picture camera in front of a theater stage and we filmed theater because everybody knew what theater was. Then somebody says, let's put the camera on a trolley and get a pan. Let's do a jump cut. Let's do montage. And, Eisenstein invents montage. Right now with the web, we're still in the books, radio shows, TV and movies kind of stage. We have not bumped up to figure out how the medium can actually help us think together.
And the fluidity across them. I think this is why text, I think, has such a place, because you kind of choose your own adventure. You can move as fast as you want. You can stop and think about something. It's like cumbersome to do that in media that is like audio or video. It's not as easy to like embed things and like go down the rabbit hole. Text is very good for that. And so I think it has its place. I will also say this is going to be a whole other conversation, but I think when we talk about the takeover of audio or video or the metaverse, there's also industrial interest in this. I mean, like this like super inefficient, like the future of all reality is going to be this virtual reality, and we're going to forget your real face and have this virtual face. Like, it makes sense in certain environments, but there's always this hype to say like, oh, this is the next exciting thing. Just like when you read TechCrunch, you're getting like the end of the success story and not the 10 years that went into blood and pain going into it. And so I think a lot of the numbers, I mean, even with media, right? We had publishers suffered greatly over the past, the pandemic distorts my sense of time. I don't know, 5 or 7 years ago, but there was this wave to make everything video, short form video. And publishers spent so much money on it and they got burned so badly because a lot of times it's based on fake Facebook data. And so like how we decide if something is a trend, it's tricky, but yeah.
What was the name of the Q startup? Quilio?
Quip or
Quimby?
Yeah. Either way, yeah.
Thank you. So we are observing a lot of problems, but in the end, I'm thinking and I'm asking you guys, who's responsible to solve these problems? Aren't we, each and every one of us, responsible? And if so, I guess my conclusion would be like, it's my choice to, and it should be my responsibility to find context, to spot the attention monsters. So it's about our choices, or is there somebody else who is, I don't know, responsible to help us solve the problem?
Go ahead and I'll follow you because I want to add to it.
So I think it's both. There's just like with regular pollution, we over-index and start saying it's all about the consumer, and then we forget about the root cause and the main polluters. I think you can easily get into the same thing with the information environment, where you start saying like, oh, everybody should be responsible, media literacy, digital literacy. Okay, but what are we doing about the sources? And what are we doing about the platforms? Of course, everybody has their own responsibility, but I think the thing we have to be very mindful of and remember is that a lot of solutions that aim for media literacy, digital literacy, helping people and saying like, oh, you should be responsible, that's relying on good behavior. And it's relying on people having the bandwidth in their brain to think about that or being personally motivated by it. And people are busy. People are so busy. They're stretched thin, especially in today's world. And you might be motivated today if I tell you like, oh, I'll give you a thing which tells you about news bias. A lot of people forget by next week. And so I think what we need is also systems that motivate people constructively, whether they are government top-down, just like there's government initiatives that encourage you and motivate you to eat healthier, but also systems and solutions at the ground level for consumers which motivate them. I think the platforms could easily do a better job of rewarding you for being constructive and helpful instead of being like super angry and making everybody angry. So I think it goes both ways.
So I think people are not just really, really busy and jammed, they're also overwhelmed. The problems we face are overwhelming. We're drowning in the info torrent. There's way too much information to make through. So we're just completely overwhelmed. And kind of what we're saying here is we're telling everybody to eat your broccoli. You know, you need to eat your vegetables. And there's a whole little theme out there called hide the broccoli. Like, how do you get kids to eat the broccoli? You turn it into something fun, and then maybe they'll eat their broccoli. And we're saying, hey, public, you need to eat your broccoli. Otherwise, you're all going to be dumb and we're going to lose civilization. And that doesn't really work. And to make things a little more complicated, facts don't generally change people's minds. Stories do, emotions do. Facts don't. You can show somebody, you can show a conspiracy theorist facts that completely and accurately disprove their conspiracy theory, and they'll just double down. They will not be pulled out of the conspiracy world. But if you bond with them and bring them to a different kind of environment, you can kind of get them out. It's sort of like cult deprogramming in some interesting ways. So part of the problem here is that we stopped treating humans as citizens, and we think of ourselves and call ourselves consumers now. So I said that my journey started 30 years ago when I realized I hated the word consumer. This is why. So when you're a consumer, I just care that you buy more crap, and I really don't care about your life, right? And there's a guy out there who's traced the history of how philosophers affected policymakers, affected economists, affected politicians in this changing of citizen to consumer. In the United States, current antitrust law is the Bork rule, Robert Bork, the guy who didn't get confirmed to the Supreme Court, which basically says everyday low prices means there's no monopoly, which is wrong. And we have Lena Khan in the FTC right now trying to overturn that, and I don't know if she'll succeed, but it's just wrong, right? So the fact that we call ourselves consumers and are willing to be called that means we're just kind of going along with this. We're overwhelmed. We're being fed cheap calories. It's going to be hard to get people to eat their broccoli. I'm not a big fan of gamification, but when you said, how about if I upgrade your LinkedIn account, I was like, oh, I perked up, because I don't pay LinkedIn any money and I use it all the time, and I try to post good info. And if that meant that I got the benefits of a paid LinkedIn account, I'd be like, and then I loved your suggestion for Twitter. And I have my own little suggestion for Twitter, which is, shouldn't there be a Twitter service which basically tags up your tweets and retweets and says, hey, by the way, this was complete bullshit. And this was pretty good. And pat on the back for this one and a LinkedIn upgrade. And this one, man, you do this a bunch more times and we're going to put you in the red bin, right? But why can't they look at my tweet stream? They have it, and tag it up.
I think this is a huge opportunity for like consumer level solutions or add-ons.
There's that word.
Right.
It's automatic.
It is.
The word is automatic. It's baked in.
Even when we talk I think it's parallel difference between users and human experience design, right? Like so I think we don't fight fire with fire. I think there is absolute opportunity to fight fire with fire. And I think it'd be very effective, because ultimately advertising value sucks the value out to somebody else. If you make it status value intrinsically and education value and inclusion value, that gets to the user, and they're really gonna care. So fingers crossed.
So it's a matter of both the platforms giving different incentives, but I was thinking back of your parallel to the diet. It's also a responsibility of ourselves, and maybe at the beginning, like with a diet, of trying to eat broccoli or more healthy, it doesn't feel natural and it seems a bit of an effort. But then it grows into you and you develop this awareness of, does this food make me feel good or not? Is it nutritious or not?
And I don't think enough of us are focused on the feel-good part of, oh, I did the right thing informationally, right? Whatever that means. But we're not we're so busy fighting the torrent and the misinformation and whatever else that we don't think about, hey, when somebody's behaving great and improving and shifting their info diet, what's that experience? How does that work?
And just on the point coming back to around cancel culture, kind of adjacent to that, again, also the way we reward people. You get like thumbs up, you get likes, all this stuff. What would happen if the main metric was you changed my mind? Like,
oh, that's amazing.
We can make such big differences in just like these tweaks. But again, it's meant to be frictionless.
I love the people who put a table out someplace with a big sign that says, some statement, change my mind.
Yeah.
There's a question in the back of the room.
Yeah, so my comment was actually kind of on the same, consumer versus citizen. I'm now reading the book Citizens by John Alexander, which is probably the person that you were referencing that has done kind of all
John
this.
Alexander?
Yep.
Yeah, he's not the guy I was referencing, but I know him. Yeah.
So kind of my comment was along the same lines. As we think about, our presence online, not think of us only as consumers. So what do we read? What do we look at? But also, what is our impact of our actions on others? Because even if we may say, oh, I'm going to, indulge on a little bit of this, well, my action actually adds up to the actions of everyone else and is then causing all of those, not necessarily fake news, but news that don't really add value to get generated and shared once over and over and over again. So think about our impact on others as well. So not just, what we consume, but also how are our actions impacting others? Because that is when we take that perspective of being citizens.
I think that'd be great. And it kind of makes me think of the part about impact where we measure the average Romanian has this much pollution per year. And what are we doing about it? Here's how much. Like, it'd be really cool using the data we have where you could see like, these 3 trends were the most toxic this week. And you inadvertently supported one of them when you did this. And you just thought you were like consuming, but actually like you helped it go viral because you gave it the view and the algorithm boosted it and this and that. That'd be awesome. And I think is quite important.
The person I was referring to is Barry Lynn, who is the head of Citizens Against Monopoly and of the Open Markets Institute. Really interesting, kind of very intense guy, trying to stop everything from being monopolized. And then I'll add one thing, which is obesity and smoking are social. They are very social. You smoke when your buddies smoke and you socialize with smokers because, hey, otherwise you can't, go sit together or you meet them outside having a puff or whatever. What you're saying applies very much to information. And one of the reasons for Stop the Steal, for the denial of election movement being so vehement and so strong in the US is that all their neighbors are doing exactly the same thing. And all the lawn signs and everything everybody's yelling and chanting and what the parson is saying, on Sunday in church is all lined up. How could anybody be believing something else? And that's really frightening to me.
You mentioned cult deprogramming. I think it's so appropriate. And we also don't spend enough time, everybody here probably knows a conspiracy theorist or like has interacted with one. It's so normalized now or like they're plugged in everywhere. There's a clear pattern. Like for a lot of people, they do it because it's exciting. Like you see how they get like, this is so great and I'm part of something.
You feel like you're part of an insurrection.
Yeah, and you also know things that others don't. How exciting is that in a world where everything is confusing and you're always lost?
I can see that there are incels sitting behind, sitting at home in their little chair with a beer on 8chan who are busy giving each other virtual high fives because their Pepe the Frog gif went viral today. Yeah. And they're forming community. And they're getting feedback they never got before, and they feel like they're part of an insurrection. And all that stuff feeds your soul.
It's super exciting. Yeah.
There are much people that believe that Romania is the cradle of civilization, that everything started here, that we have some magical places and that a lot of places in Europe were actually first inhabited by people that came from here, and that our language is one of the oldest in the world. No, you don't know that?
So Decopati, just to give some context, Deisha is the name of the region. is
like a
on the land of
historical-
today. Yeah. So Dakopati is, yeah.
And there are books and there are very, very intelligent people that believe these things.
I mean, you probably know more.
And they linked it with other conspiracy theories and it all makes sense in their mind.
I think the only thing I could say on that is like patriotism is always adjacent in a lot of cases to these things, especially as it's attached to power. And so like the transition from an idea to how it makes me feel like I'm patting everybody on the back through some concept that makes us all feel special is usually some pattern you can find. So that actually doesn't surprise me.
I'm going to identify this conspiracy theorist and add them to my brain. Thank you.
Had another comment on that, which is I feel like that's a lot around confirmation bias. We tend to look for information and data that kind of supports our own belief. So how, and I don't know, maybe this is already part of Readocracy, but how do we even show people that they tend to consume things that confirm their existing beliefs? And how do we even kind of, to your point of the algorithm, maybe challenge them to consume things that are outside of their normal pattern?
So we are releasing this later this year, and I think any platform could. It's like, it's not that difficult. You just have to want to. And so like with Readocracy, you can build your own algorithm, but 20% of what you see labeled will be the polar opposite of what you tend to consume. And there's like 6 or 7 lenses through which you can see this. Angry versus like positive news, negative news, political or not, from a certain country or another country, creative or rational, left and right. There's like 6 or 7 vectors you can look across that we don't even realize. There's all these different layers to the bubble and kind of suggest that. And what's interesting about it is we're working with some research partners now where hopefully we're going to have some conclusive data about this, but I'm really curious to know if somebody's going through their feed and they have a suggestion mixed in that says, just so you know, you've been consuming a lot of this, so here's something from the opposite from a trusted source on whatever lens. Do they even need to read it? Or is it enough to just present them that post and if they skip over, that idea is in the back of their mind?
So I'm really torn on that because there's something called the mere exposure effect, which says it's the familiarity effect, which says that like once you see something, you start to sort of believe it just because you've seen it 5 times. So if I'm on the right side of an issue and I'm shown a whole bunch of material on the other side, which would be fair, the thing to do I start to believe those things, or do I sort of, does it actually work backwards?
I'm curious to see, like again, unfinished, but it's interesting because the social context, right? It's one thing for somebody to tell you you're wrong or like this, and something that's like privately just saying like, just here's the information, you like non-judgmental, you decide. I'm curious to see if there's a difference there.
Really briefly, because I know we have to wrap the session.
Yeah.
My favorite social change tactic or formula is someone who's sort of like you, takes you by the hand to try something new that you weren't going to try yourself before. That is a gigantic global mechanism for change. So take your friends who think differently and bring them into a different conversation, take them to a different place, bring them to Unfinished, whatever it might be. That's your opportunity to tip this thing, because all the other strategies are dicey and maybe don't work.
I love that. And you could theoretically even do that in the platforms.
So I just want to chime in here regarding the Unfinished platform, that there's actually a feature. I don't know if you used social mood, but you have 2 modes. You have the cozy and you have the frisky. So if you have the frisky, you'll meet the people that are different to you, which never happens on the other platform, right? But it could be easily implemented, because if you get similar people recommendation, you can also get different. And regarding to a point that you made earlier, I loved this idea about being happy about changing your mind. Make me change my mind. That's usually you're angry at yourself. The first instinct is to be angry. But how about we change the frame and think of it as, oh, I learned something today. That's great. So yeah, I just
if that
were
a normal reaction. Do we have time for one more question?
One small idea, so it's not really a question. For example, I really love this parallel between food and information, but I don't know how much our society is prepared to label this information as hate speech, disinformation. Like we know broccoli is healthy, but do we have this reaction instantly with information? I think it's both ways. We need also the public to be educated to know that this is anger creating, this is hate speech, but also we need the people who are creating the algorithm and putting the labels to be aware that this is discrimination, this is I don't know what, and I don't know how in this fast society we can do this labeling. How like somebody said that we have people that believe that everything started in Romania. How you will label this? Because for them it's your truth against their truth. It's not like with broccoli.
I think what Jerry said about like the gradual path you can take somebody on is very powerful. Yeah, I think a major problem we have is we tend to over-engineer and go from like, okay, we have a really messed up situation. What is the perfect solution? We're going to do everything. We're going to like find the edge cases like this, and we have to solve those two all in one go. A lot of the issues can be solved with things we readily have now and are not as controversial as this, like just binary. Like there are such obvious indicators of clickbait, rage bait, exaggeration. Those are so easy to spot, and you can't debate about them. They're like, you can see them. There's like the data, you can have open source models for them. And so I think we can like at least start somewhere. And then of course, education is important. I mean, again, broccoli is something you learn about that is important.
Just a brief note that concerns me a lot. Which regime is in power matters enormously, which means, hey, we got a good regime, then misinformation is labeled misinformation. And guess what happens when the politics switch? If there's an ability to change all those labels, then people who are actually making sense are labeled as misinformation. And it's basically one of Trump's favorite tactics is called Darvo. I have to always look it up. Everybody know what raise your hand if you've heard of Darvo. Oh man, awesome. Has a Wikipedia page. It's called Deny the Abuse, then attack the victim for attempting to make them accountable for their offense, thereby reversing victim and offender.
Wow.
So it's basically telling the other person they've done a terrible thing when in fact it's the very thing you've done. And if you listen to the far right, that's what they're doing. So when Donald Trump says the Biden crime family, Donald Trump, mafia don par excellence, like he knows enough to speak codedly so that he's never easily pinned down, he's doing Darvo. That's like Darvo. That's Darvo. It's sort of like gaslighting. Gaslighting is just denying something happened. Darvo is flipping the guilt for the offense. Darvo is a really important word. The researcher is Jennifer Freyd, F-R-E-Y-D.
The thing I want to add to that I didn't mention, and maybe when we were talking about censorship, which is very important, and we end up having this discussion a lot. This is the importance of transparency. A central government should not be able to change it or have somebody sitting in a dark room making all the decisions. We have tons of data. We have the means to make it accessible in everybody's pocket. I mean, with blockchain, like having a record where you see all the things that happen and all the chain of events. There's a very big difference. We get scared of these labels and we say, oh, you're immediately going to become totalitarian China. But there's a big difference between having a system, because, okay, let's contrast. China, there is a set of filters and rules in the background, and if you fall on the wrong side, you have no idea why. You can't see the rules. You have a general idea. You can't argue about it. You can't say this should be changed. You'll probably end up in jail and never seen again. Another system doesn't have to be like that. It can be completely transparent where other people can see. You're allowed to complain about it without any repercussions. You can see the log of complaints. There are a lot of ways we can do this differently where a public system of accountability can be the solution. And we're very quick to assume that any form of accountability is automatically totalitarian. These things don't have to be tied together. There's, of course, a huge risk, and we have to be very, very good at designing it. But it reminds me of that quote. I think it was in The Intercept, like 2017 or so, forgetting the journalist, but they said something like, you have to believe that a company that spent something like $370 million building solar-powered planes and beaming internet to the world so they can serve their surveillance capitalism, Facebook, has the means to build some better systems if they put the same energy in. And I think we're very defeatist when we kind of say, oh, like, let's not bother because it's going to get like dangerous really quick. Have we tried in good faith without letting these people be the ones who tell us what the future is?
And I think part of their problem, part of their dilemma is that the world seems to be split nearly 50-50 between fringe right and moderate left, whatever, because there's no real fringe left as far as I can tell right now. It kind of got stamped out. The left moved to the center. And so they're afraid if they take dramatic measures, which are in fact needed, they'll just alienate 50% of their user base. Or worse, get sued out of existence, or if the regime changes, get put out of business. And that's their existential risk. So how do we protect them from that? How do we motivate them to actually overcome that, step through it?
That's the same challenge as decoupling the economic profitability from pollution to this, decoupling economic profitability from attention monsters.
Or making it negative, making sure that if there is a coupling, that they have to pay.
That's right, yeah.
Again, I just don't see how it is so complicated, and we don't have to over-engineer it. Like, again, you got over 1 million followers. All right, there's some standards here, even if it's just like very prominent labels. We could start somewhere instead of nowhere and saying we have to solve everything at once and then just keep wondering why everything's ruined.
But meanwhile, we can use the tools, we can make our own tools, and we can keep discussing about this, probably at lunch, right?
Anybody hungry?
Because we're a bit over time. Yes. Thank you so much for the lovely discussion.
Thank you, everybody.